Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're tackling someone really interesting today, Greg Cochran. You've probably heard of him.
Definitely a thinker who provokes a lot of discussion.
Right. So we're going to deep dive into his ideas, pulling mainly from his conversations on the Future Strategist podcast. It's a great resource, but Cochran covers so much ground.
Oh yeah, he jumps around quite a bit.
He does. And that's where we come in, right? We'll synthesize, connect the dots, so you can walk away with a really solid grasp of his core arguments.
Yeah.
We want to make these complex topics accessible without losing any of the depth.
Absolutely. Cochran doesn't shy away from challenging established views. He really pushes you to think differently.
Okay, so first up, let's talk COVID. Cochran, he was sounding the alarm pretty early on about how serious this thing could be.
Back in February 2020, right? Way before a lot of officials were taking it seriously.
Yeah, way before. And remember, back then, many were still pushing the narrative that it was just like the flu. Cochran wasn't buying it.
And his early predictions, unfortunately, turned out to be pretty accurate.
They did. Which kind of makes you pay attention to what else he has to say, right? Like his take on the public health response.
Not exactly glowing praise, was it?
Not at all. He was pretty blunt, actually. He basically said that public health, at least in recent times, hasn't exactly been a magnet for the sharpest minds.
Ouch.
Yeah, kind of a harsh assessment. But he suggested there was a time when the public health infrastructure was more effective, maybe even staffed with more competent people. So, it gets you thinking about how we develop and empower expertise when it really matters.
It's a critical point, especially when facing new threats like a pandemic.
And then, of course, there were lockdowns. Cochran had some insightful observations about those, too. He compared, China's super strict early lockdowns with the more varied approaches, maybe less stringent in places like Italy.
Right, highlighting the challenges of maintaining those really strict lockdowns for long periods.
Exactly. And how different countries have different economic realities, different capacities to even implement them in the first place. He even pointed out how a country with a lot of non-essential workers, like the U.S., might face different economic pressures compared to a country like China, where more people are engaged in essential tasks for basic survival.
Makes sense. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Another thing he was really hammering on early on was testing, like widespread testing.
Both fever checks and the etiological kind, right, to actually confirm the presence of the virus.
Exactly. It seems so obvious now, but testing was a major bottleneck in those early months.
I think for Cochran, it was about understanding the true scale and spread. You can't manage a pandemic effectively if you don't know where the virus is and how fast it's spreading.
Right. Without that, it's like trying to navigate a maze in the dark. Okay, vaccines. He was pretty optimistic about how quickly they were developed.
Pointed out the sheer number of research efforts going on around the world.
Yeah, and that the funding, while significant, wasn't like building the Hoover Dam from scratch.
Yeah.
An interesting comparison.
Yeah, framing it that way really highlights the potential for rapid scientific progress when the whole world focuses on a single challenge.
He also brought up antibody therapy, specifically convalescent plasma. He seemed to think it had real potential, but then he made this really intriguing point.
About how it wasn't patentable, right?
Yeah. And how that might have played a role in why it didn't get as much attention. Maybe because it wasn't as profitable as, say, a brand new drug.
Yeah.
Makes you think about what really drives medical research, doesn't it?
It definitely raises questions about the interplay between science, profits, and the choices made about which treatments to prioritize.
All right, so the future of the virus. Cochran, being Cochran, he was already thinking about that. He anticipated the rise of variants, like way back then. He even used what we now call the British variant as an example.
And discussed the possibility that the virus could become more lethal.
Right, although he thought it probably wouldn't reach the levels of something like MERS or SARS-1. Still, a sobering thought, because viruses are constantly changing, aren't they?
They are, and Cochran's early grasp of viral evolution underscores just how crucial that understanding is for predicting future risks.
And he even brought up the 1918 flu pandemic, calling it a potential worst-case scenario. The death tolls, both worldwide and in the U.S., were just staggering. It's a stark reminder of the potential magnitude of a global pandemic.
Absolutely. Putting things in historical context is so important for assessing risk. The 1918 flu, it's a reminder that these events can have truly devastating consequences.
Of course, Cochran didn't shy away from what he saw as missteps in the pandemic response. He talked about what he called unforced errors, like downplaying the seriousness of the virus early on.
And remember his point about asymptomatic transmission.
Oh yeah, that there wasn't really strong evidence to suggest that asymptomatic individuals were completely non-infectious. This was a huge debate early on, wasn't it?
Absolutely. So much uncertainty in those early days. It was probably a combination of incomplete information, maybe political considerations too, and just a rapidly evolving understanding of how the virus actually spread.
He also talked about something he called a distorted sense of time during the pandemic, like people minimizing the current risks by comparing them to earlier periods when infection rates were much higher. He used California as an example. It's a subtle point, but it makes you think about how we perceive risk during a crisis.
It probably stems from our natural tendency to anchor on the most intense periods. So as things naturally slow down, there's this risk of complacency, even though the absolute numbers might still be high.
Yeah, it's like we become desensitized to the ongoing danger because the rate of increase has slowed. Okay, last thing on COVID. He mentioned this example of Peter Shaw, who apparently got in trouble professionally for saying something about riots potentially hurting left-wing parties.
It was an inconvenient truth, basically.
It was. And it kind of highlights how political factors can sometimes creep into discussions of seemingly unrelated issues. Makes you think about how information gets filtered, especially in a charged political environment.
Definitely underscores the importance of open and objective discourse, even, or perhaps especially when topics are sensitive.
All right, let's move on to another fascinating area. Prehistoric human migrations and what genetics can tell us about our past. Cochran talked about the peopling of the Americas, and it seems the traditional ice-free corridor theory, while still relevant, is probably just one piece of a much bigger story.
Right. Sites like Monteverde and Chile suggest that humans were in the Americas way earlier than the ice-free corridor would allow.
Exactly, and genetic evidence is backing this up.
It provides these independent lines of evidence that support earlier migrations. When you look at the diversity and distribution of certain genetic markers in Native American populations, it points to migration routes and timings that predate the opening of that corridor.
He also mentioned multiple waves of migration to the Americas, like the ancestors of groups like the Na-Dene and Eskimo Ute. So it's not just one initial wave, but several distinct groups arriving over time.
And this multi-wave model really helps explain the incredible linguistic and genetic diversity we see in indigenous populations across the Americas.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The genetic links between some American Indian populations and Europeans, specifically the X2 mitochondrial DNA lineage.
It suggests a shared ancestral population somewhere in the very distant past.
A connection stretching across continents. It's amazing what we're learning about ancient human movements through genetics.
The X2 lineage is a prime example of how genetic research is constantly revealing these unexpected connections, challenging our previous assumptions about how humans dispersed across the globe.
He did caution against reading too much into mitochondrial and Y chromosome data alone, though.
Of course, it's always important to consider the full picture, the complexities of genetic inheritance.
Moving on to Neanderthals, Cochran talked about how interbreeding between them and early humans wasn't just a one-off thing. Some Neanderthal genes were actually beneficial and spread throughout modern human populations.
Particularly genes related to skin, hair, and the immune system.
Yeah, like those keratin genes that might have helped us adapt to colder climates. It's a fascinating example of how interspecies interactions could shape our evolution.
Absolutely. The persistence and spread of certain Neanderthal genes strongly suggests they provided a selective advantage, maybe helping us adapt to new environments or resist new pathogens as we moved out of Africa.
He also discussed the origins and spread of the Indo-European languages. He talked about the work of David Anthony and how this expansion was probably a pretty violent process.
Right, involving population displacement rather than peaceful cultural exchange. It challenges those older, more romanticized views.
And here's where it gets mind-blowing. He connected the Yamnaya culture, those folks associated with the early Indo-Europeans, to potential migrations into the Americas.
A connection spanning vast distances and timescales.
Yeah, it's called the Kurgan hypothesis. It suggests a much wider, more interconnected pattern of ancient human movement than we might imagine. Finally, he had a rather blunt way of describing the impact of early humans on those megafauna extinctions in the Americas. Indians show up and have a barbecue.
A bit provocative, but it definitely highlights the potential ecological consequences of human arrival in new territories.
It does. Okay, let's jump to a more contemporary and often controversial topic. intelligence, or IQ, and how it relates to education. Cochran defined IQ as a measure that predicts certain abilities, like how quickly we process information and our ability to solve complex problems.
He emphasized its predictive power, things like job placement and academic performance.
Right, but it's important to remember it's a statistical correlation, not a destiny.
Exactly. IQ scores tell us something about probabilities, but they don't define an individual's potential. Environmental factors, they play a huge role too.
He also pointed out that while there are different kinds of intelligent spatial reasoning, for instance, they tend to be positively correlated.
Someone who excels in one area is often pretty good in others too.
Right. But he did say that measuring IQ in very young children is tricky. Vocabulary size, that's a pretty good indicator for 3-year-olds, apparently.
It's because cognitive abilities are still developing rapidly at that age. The tests rely on language and cognitive tasks that little kids might not be ready for.
Makes sense. Now, the heritability of intelligence and personality, this is a sensitive one.
Yeah, it gets people fired up.
Cochran, he was pretty straightforward, though. Said there's a significant genetic component.
He did acknowledge it's a controversial view, though.
He did. It's important to be clear about what heritability actually means.
Right. We're not saying someone's intelligence is, say, 50% predetermined by their genes. It's more about how much of the variation in intelligence within a specific population is due to genetic differences.
Got it. So it's about the differences within a group, not about any individual's fixed potential.
Exactly.
Then he threw out this really wild thought experiment. He speculated about what might happen if we selectively bred for higher IQ.
He suggested it could lead to an overrepresentation of certain personality types. He even mentioned, vaguely, something about autistic-like traits.
It's provocative, to say the least. Raises all sorts of ethical questions about what we consider desirable traits and the potential unintended consequences of messing with human genetics.
Definitely a lot to unpack there.
Okay, his take on higher education was interesting, too. He talked about the signaling theory of education.
The idea that a degree is more of a signal to employers about certain qualities.
Yeah, like intelligence, work ethic, conformity. Yeah. Maybe the skills learned aren't as important as the degree itself. It's like a stamp of approval, you know.
Exactly. It's a way for employers to filter candidates, basically. They're looking for certain underlying traits, and a degree from a tough program signals that a person has them, even if what they studied isn't directly related to the job.
He also talked about the limitations of far transfer of knowledge, like how skills you learn in one area don't always translate to others.
Makes sense. Some skills are more general and adaptable, while others are very specific.
Right. He did say that foundational skills like statistics and reading, those are universally useful, though.
They're kind of like the building blocks. Help you think critically, process information effectively, regardless of the specific field.
Then he brought up a concern about too much conformity in both education and employment, how it might stifle creativity and innovation.
It's a delicate balance, right? You need some conformity for things to run smoothly, but you don't want to squash the kind of thinking that leads to breakthroughs.
All right, let's dive into history and societal trends. Cochran observed this apparent increase in political correctness over time.
And he couldn't find a clear genetic or demographic explanation.
Yeah, it seems more like a cultural shift, maybe influenced by things like social media, evolving views on social justice, changing values.
Lots of potential factors at play there. It's a complex phenomenon.
He also reminded us that pandemics, they're not new, like they've been happening throughout history.
He pointed to the plague of Justinian and the Antonine plague. Huge outbreaks long before COVID.
It's a good reminder, right, that we shouldn't be surprised by these things. They're a recurring challenge for humanity. We need to learn from the past to prepare for the future.
Absolutely. History is full of lessons if we're willing to learn them.
All right, libertarianism. Cochran seemed to have a nuanced view, didn't he?
Yeah, he acknowledged the appeal, the focus on individual liberty.
But he also recognized the challenges, especially when dealing with something like a pandemic, where individual actions have huge consequences for everyone else.
It's that classic tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility.
He also touched on mercantilism, pointing out how wars were fought over these policies, even though they might not have been economically sound. And he questioned the value of a lot of pre-classical trade,
suggesting it was mostly about luxury goods, not essentials, tin being the exception.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what really drove those early economic interactions. And finally, he didn't shy away from the role of conquest in human history. how populations and languages spread, often through violence and displacement. The Indo-European expansion, that was a prime example.
It's a sobering reminder of the darker side of our past.
It is. Okay, our last stop today, space exploration and the mind-blowing idea of self-replicating machines.
Cochran seemed pretty excited about the potential there.
Oh yeah, he was all in. Machines, mining asteroids, harnessing solar energy, beaming power back to Earth.
It does sound like science fiction.
It does, but he made it sound surprisingly plausible. And he stressed the importance of keeping the initial design simple.
To make self-replication more reliable, right?
Yeah. And he talked about the possibility of remote software updates. Imagine updating robots that are millions of miles away.
It would be amazing, wouldn't it? That kind of adaptability. But it also introduces the possibility of unintended consequences, these machines evolving in ways we don't anticipate.
He even compared the potential impact of this technology to other major advancements, like improvements in rocketry or electric vehicles. He said it could be orders of magnitude greater.
He was talking about factors of millions, not just incremental improvements. The scale is almost incomprehensible.
It is. And then, of course, the ethical questions, like, are we creating a new form of life? What are our responsibilities? And then there's the sheer energy required for truly massive space engineering projects, like moving planets.
Yeah, he contrasted that with things like terraforming, which are huge, but still dwarfed by the energy needed to move an entire planet.
So that's it. We've covered a lot of ground today, from pandemics to prehistory to the future of space exploration. Cochran's thinking, it's complex, it's provocative, it's often unconventional.
He pushes you to think outside the box, to question assumptions.
He does. And for you, our listeners, hopefully this deep dive has given you a solid grasp of some really fascinating ideas.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about biology and evolution, how these forces shape our past, present, and even our future. Maybe it's something to ponder. How do those fundamental principles influence the world around us, even in ways we might not expect?
And thinking about Cochran's views on technologies like self-replicating machines, it raises questions about the ethical and societal implications of such powerful tools. What kind of future are we creating? How do we ensure it's a future we want?
So much to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mind of Greg Cochran. We hope you found it illuminating.